Rome's hunger for expansion wasn't just about land. It was about slaves. Every Roman conquest filled the empire's slave markets with new victims. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, modern-day France, he enslaved nearly 1 million people. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE left over 50,000 men, women, and children in chains. Entire cities like Corinth in Greece were wiped out, and their survivors were sold into slavery. Roman generals didn't just wage war for glory, they did it for profit. More slaves meant more wealth. The captured were paraded through the streets of Rome before being auctioned off like livestock. Some never knew freedom at all. If your mother was a slave, you were doomed to be one too. Some Romans sold themselves, or their children, into slavery. Why? Desperation. Rome had no mercy for the poor, and debt could destroy a family. Some parents had no choice but to sell their own children to pay off their debts or survive a famine. Household slaves often had the least physically demanding jobs. Serving in the homes of wealthy Roman citizens, they worked as cooks, cleaners, butlers, or even tutors for the children of their masters. Some were given responsibilities such as accounting or managing estates, while others worked as personal attendants, dressing their owners or preparing their baths. Their work was grueling, and their obedience had to be absolute. Even in these more privileged positions, slaves faced constant discipline. If they made even a minor mistake, such as spilling wine or failing to respond quickly to a command, they could be whipped, beaten, or even sold to a crueler master. For agricultural slaves, life was far worse. These slaves worked from sunrise to sunset in vast fields, growing the crops that fed the Roman population. They labored under the scorching heat, enduring long hours of back-breaking work with little food and even less rest. Many were chained together at night to prevent escape, forced to sleep in filthy, overcrowded conditions. Their masters viewed them as nothing more than tools to produce wealth, and if they grew too weak to work, they were either abandoned or left to die. However, of all the slaves in Rome, none suffered more than those sent to the mines and quarries. This was a death sentence. Forced into dark, suffocating tunnels deep within the earth, these slaves worked in unbearable heat and breathed in dust that slowly destroyed their lungs. There was no relief from the back-breaking labor, no chance for rest. Whips and clubs ensured that the exhausted and starving slaves kept working. Injuries were common, but medical treatment was non-existent. If a slave could no longer work, they were simply discarded and replaced. Their lives meant nothing. Some slaves met an even more violent fate, those who were chosen to become gladiators or to entertain the bloodthirsty crowds in the Colosseum. Forced into brutal combat, these slaves were trained in harsh conditions, their bodies molded into weapons for the amusement of the Roman elite. While some gained fame and a rare chance at freedom, most perished in the arena, slaughtered for sport. If they refused to fight, they were executed on the spot. Being a slave in Rome meant living under the constant threat of punishment. Roman law provided no protection for slaves, as they were considered mere property. Their masters had absolute control over them, and discipline was often cruel and merciless. Whipping was one of the most common forms of punishment, used for both minor infractions and serious disobedience. Some slaves were branded with hot irons to mark them as property, a permanent reminder that they were owned. Others had their ears or noses cut off as punishment for attempting to escape. For those who dared to run away, the consequences were terrifying. If caught, runaway slaves were often crucified as a warning to others. Some were beaten to death, while others had their Achilles tendons cut so they could never run again. A single act of rebellion could lead to a public execution, with fellow slaves forced to watch as a reminder of their place in society. In extreme cases, entire households of slaves were executed if their master was murdered. Roman law dictated that if a master was killed and the culprit was not found, every slave in the household, no matter their age or innocence, would be put to death. There are recorded cases where dozens, even hundreds of slaves were brutally executed simply because their master had been killed. The lives of female slaves varied depending on where they were placed, but their treatment was almost always harsh. They were assigned work in wealthy households, businesses, brothels, or even as personal attendants for elite Roman women. Some held positions of relative comfort, while others suffered through endless abuse. One of the most common roles for female slaves was domestic service. Women worked as cooks, cleaners, nannies, and personal maids. They cared for the children of their masters, prepared meals, washed clothes, and maintained the household. In some cases, they served as personal attendants to wealthy Roman women, helping them bathe, dress, and apply cosmetics. While these roles might seem preferable to laboring in the fields, the reality was far from easy. Household slaves were at the mercy of their mistresses and masters, constantly expected to obey without hesitation. A single mistake, a stain on a tunic, an error in preparing a meal, could result in brutal punishment. For those who worked in agriculture, the suffering was even greater. These women endured the same grueling conditions as male slaves, spending their days harvesting crops, plowing fields, and carrying heavy loads under the scorching sun. Their masters saw them as little more than livestock, useful only for their labor and ability to produce more slaves. Pregnant women were often forced to continue working until they gave birth, and many died from exhaustion or lack of medical care. Some female slaves were forced into entertainment roles, trained as dancers or musicians to perform at lavish Roman banquets. These performances were not just about skill or art. They were often designed for the pleasure of the audience. Women who failed to entertain their masters could be beaten or sold to a brothel. However, the most horrifying fate for many female slaves was being forced into prostitution. The Roman Empire had a thriving sex industry, and many brothels were filled with women who had been bought and sold as if they were merchandise. Unlike free prostitutes, who could at least keep some of their earnings, slave prostitutes had no control over their lives. They were often subjected to daily abuse, forced to serve dozens of men, and had no hope of escape. Many did not live long, suffering from disease, violence, or sheer despair. Young girls were particularly vulnerable, often taken as concubines by their owners. These relationships were never consensual. Slaves had no right to refuse. Many were repeatedly assaulted, forced to bear children who would also become slaves. Some masters sold their slaves' children for profit, tearing families apart without a second thought. Even household slaves who might have had better conditions lived in constant fear. A master's unwanted attention could mean being forced into his bed, and refusing would only bring punishment. Mistresses, too, could be cruel, taking out their jealousy and anger on slave women who were unfortunate enough to catch their husband's eye. The suffering didn't end with pregnancy. Many female slaves who gave birth were treated as nothing more than breeding stock. Their children were often taken from them at birth, raised as property to be sold when they were old enough to work. Some women were even forced to become wet nurses, feeding the children of their masters while being denied the right to care for their own. Despite their suffering, some female slaves fought back. There were countless acts of resistance, small and large, against the cruelty of their masters.